never-ending fire hose of what the fucks never slows down. And I keep hearing all of these scholars debating, are we going to be in a constitutional crisis? At what point does this become a constitutional crisis? Well, who's to say it isn't already? It certainly feels like one, especially when Donald Trump doesn't seem to be obeying what these judges are saying, which could be the scariest thing that has happened yet. I'm so thrilled to welcome the great Professor Corey Brettschneider to our show. He has been classing up our show for ages, and you may have read his analyses of the Trump administration everywhere from Politico to the New York Times to Time Magazine. He teaches in the poli-sci department at Brown. You should own his book, The Oath and the Office, A Guide to the Constitution for Future Presidents. And his newest book is called The Presidents and the People, Five Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It. And Corey's even got a brand new podcast coming out called The Presidents of the People, which apparently, I'm sorry, no, it's not called that. That's the new book. His new podcast is called The Oath and the Office. And I should know that because I'm doing it with him. Corey, welcome. It's great to have you back.
Thanks, John. And I can't wait to record our first episode tomorrow. Our conversations here have been fantastic, and those will be even more in depth. And
I can't wait for you to get my rider of all the things I demand when I work on a podcast. It's quite extensive, so I hope you have a lot of time and a lot of budget because I have a lot of demands. The green M&Ms are just like item 10.
You are worth every penny. Be the star.
Professor, no, I've already said it's our podcast is You're the Star, I'll be the boss. But Professor, I've seldom appreciated you more. It seems like what we're about to experience are things they don't train constitutional scholars like you to know how to talk about. But if the Trump administration is already not listening to the courts, if the Trump administration is just moving ahead with policies that have been deemed illegal, like in the case of the grants, where the judge pointed out that they are not obeying his ruling, I mean, doesn't that mean we've crossed the line into constitutional crisis? A president who is lawless and doesn't much care what anyone has to say about it?
Absolutely. It's partly the refusal to listen. And then it's also just looking at the statements and the intent. So you have the vice president, J.D. Vance, you have Elon Musk, and what they're essentially doing is saying publicly, and Vance, who went to Yale Law School, is really the most culpable in all of this because he knows better. They're saying, the president doesn't have to listen to the courts. The basis of our constitutional system is that when you act illegally and the courts tell you to stop, you stop. That's the whole idea. Now, here's the problem, and this is why we're in a constitutional crisis. If they don't believe that, and then their actions show that they don't believe it, what's to stop them? They control the army. Take, for instance, the idea that if you disobey a court order, a federal official, that one of the things that happens is that you can be held in contempt and the U.S. Marshals can be sent after you. But who controls the U.S. Marshals? It's the President of the United States. Who controls the FBI, the Department of Justice, that houses the Marshals? So the whole system relies really on norms, on people having enough virtue to listen to the law when they run afoul of it, and you're hearing the exact opposite from this. We really don't have an example of a president refusing to follow a court order. Jefferson considered it during Marbury.
Andrew Jackson? Andrew Jackson?
Well, that is, to my mind, as I've looked into it, it's a very famous story that Jackson said, Justice Smart, the Chief Justice has made his decision, now let him enforce it. But it's actually a case about a governor, not about him. So even if he did say it, and there's a lot of dispute about whether or not he did, it wasn't his refusal, even in this extreme. And don't get me wrong, I'm not defending Jackson, one of the worst presidents of all time.
Of course you are. Listen, you just got canceled, man. I heard a very clear endorsement of the Trail of Tears just now, and I had no idea you'd gone MAGA, Corey. How dare you? You failed the liberal purity test.
But it's really how bad things are, that even this horrific president didn't do what we're facing now. And it is unprecedented. So much of this is precedented. We have examples of presidents shutting down free speech, John Adams. We have them nationalizing white supremacy, Woodrow Wilson. But do we have them defying court orders? Even Richard Nixon in U.S. versus Nixon, when he was ordered to hand over the tapes, he certainly had flirted with a lot of the lawlessness that we're talking about, but he didn't defy the courts. He did hand over the tapes. So we are in a frightening moment. This is one of the
sucker Nixon was.
Nixon
never had to leave. He should have known that he was allowed to commit all the crimes he wants and Ford should have known he had no need to pardon Nixon because it wasn't capable for Nixon to commit crimes. I can't believe these craven aristocrats, Professor, and what they've done. Now, I mean, okay, so if Andrew Jackson, let's say he did brazenly disobey the Supreme Court, we did manage to survive as a republic. No one cares now, but that doesn't make me feel any easier when I look at this judge saying they haven't abided by the order to restart the federal grounds. When I hear about how the executive order to end the constitutional right of birthright citizenship ignores Supreme Court precedent. And he's telling them to ignore the TikTok ban that Congress passed and the Supreme Court upheld. And he won it a year ago. I mean,
Right.
when you're defying court orders this publicly, we don't have a system of checks and balances anymore, do we?
No, and I was on NPR today, and I did an hour with a great host and a great discussion. But I had to sort of at one point try to redirect the discussion because what we were doing is we were going through case by case and asking, like, what's the court going to say here? What's the ruling going to be? And while that's all well and good, you have to add it up. It's not one case. It's again and again the defying of the order to stop the freeze, the challenging repeatedly the power of Congress. That Congress has the power to spend money, and the president executes that spending power. And then let's take the extreme one, as you bring it up, the knowledge that the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, says so clearly that if you're born in the United States, you're a citizen. And even here, I should say, conservative scholars, liberal scholars, everyone agrees that's what the thing says. It's an obvious thing. You have a few instances, the John Eastman, the designer who's under indictment in the Arizona electors case, who designed the insurrection. Those are the kind of people who are saying, hey, wait a second, maybe people born to undocumented people are not somehow subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. There's an exception for that, for ambassadors, really, in the 14th Amendment. But that's the fringe idea. Why would they do such a thing? Why would they issue such an executive order? It's to collapse the system. It's to show that what we're really doing is defying the Constitution, defying the courts. And that's what you have J.D. Vance saying. That's why this is, and not that it might be, it is a constitutional crisis right now.
Oh, listen, I need to see Yale rescind their degree to law school for J.D. Vance after what he said, that the president, the executive branch is more powerful than the judicial branch. I mean, it's clear by now that what they're trying to do is to make it easier to commit crimes and not get in trouble. And there's guardrails that Trump had around him in the first term, and they're making sure those are gone. And they're trying to make it dangerous and scary for anyone to bring charges against them. And they'll for anyone to accuse them of wrongdoing. I mean, they're making it people terrified to speak up. This is Munich 1939. They do not like democratic laws. These are powerful people who don't want to be constrained. And this is what an oligarchy looks like when it's being born. And what terrifies me is we're talking about these lower court rulings, Professor, but the Supreme Court appears to be owned by him. And his fellow aristocrats have already given him carte blanche to throw out as much of the Constitution as he wants. I mean, we can't rely on the Supreme Court caring about their place in the history books and doing the right thing, can we?
That's the worry. When you and I met, I have written a piece called Trump versus the Constitution. And the point was, which is still true, that he was totally ignorant of what the document said. He said at one point, he confused the idea that courts can strike down laws with the idea that somehow they write the laws. He just didn't know the basics of how American government worked, and he thought
Corey,
the president was
the three branches of
dictator.
government. As president in the first term, he thought it was the White House, House, and Senate. He was sworn in and still didn't know judicial, legislative, and executive. I mean,
so that was the story of Trump 1.0, and the courts often did stop him. I also think he had sensible people in the executive branch and the Department of Justice, not people who I admire, but people who at least understood the basics of the law. He had, of course, a vice president who refused to abide by his demand that he stop the counting of legitimate electoral votes. People who I think you and I consider political opponents, but who understood the basics of the document. Here's the difference between that, Trump 1.0, and Trump 2.0. He has an understanding of how to collapse the system. He put 3 Supreme Court justices on the bench, and he is demanding loyalty above all else and eviscerating anyone who would defend the law as opposed to defending his will. That's a frightening thought because the executive branch when it comes down to it, although it's supposed to be bound by the law and by the court, it is powerful. He does have command of the military, the Department of Justice, the FBI, the U.S. Marshals, and he's going to use it as much as he can to destroy the system. And I think that's why we are in the midst of a constitutional crisis.